Good morning. How is everyone this morning? Good. Sorry? Better than average. Well, we'll take that. It's good to see everyone here this morning and be with you. My name is Bryan, if you don't know who I am. And we're going to be in James chapter 1 this morning as we continue on in our series called Call to Action. How is your reflection this morning? Maybe most of us probably glanced at least in the mirror, right, before we headed out the door to make sure, nothing too much was amiss, right, that we weren't missing too much and we looked reasonably put together. But, is that the only reflection that we hope to see in the mirror, that we look like reasonably put together? Last week, I had my grandkids for a few days. Their parents went off, and it's kind of juggling that work and play kind of thing, and it kind of reminded me what it was like to be a parent, right? And especially like a single parent. And really, that's the joy of being a grandparent, because you get to take them for a few days, and then you go, phew, haven't I? And the first night that the grandkids were with me, my granddaughter was kind of up during the night. And sometimes she suffers from homesickness, and that little struggle there. And, and she'd also had a long nap during the day, so that was fatal. And so anyway, the next day I'm thinking, I'm not repeating that again. And so that afternoon we went to Omsey. And we didn't take a train or anything else. We walked down to Omsey. And it's pretty much downhill. I live up in the northwest, so that was all good. And just a couple of grumbles when we got there, but soon forgotten, revived with a drink and got stuck into the things at Omsey. And to be honest, it's been a long time since I've been to Omsey, but some of the stuff is still the same. Like they have those bottle rockets, and you pump them up with water and air, and then you whoosh. I did do that for quite a long time. And then they have those puzzles there, that you have to get like rings apart and various other puzzles. And you think, oh, this is going to be so easy. And you find out you're not nearly as bright as I thought I was, right? And kind of defeated by some of that and some fossils and various kinds of things. And then after our time at Omsey, of course, it was time to leave and come back. And I said, well, let's just walk for a bit. And she said, well, but Grandpa, you said we could get an Uber. I said, well, let's just walk and see how it goes. And, and she said, well, I don't know, that's such a long way. She's 8, by the way. And, it's kind of a trial. And, I was reminding her that we're in this series in James, right? And those that you've been with us and consider it all joy, trials, right? But she was taking more convincing. But as we walked, she seemed to not notice. And then she would notice and complain for a bit, but just encouraged her. And we went to Powell's after that. And long and the short of it is that we made it there and back. And it's like over 7-mile round trip for little 8-year-old legs. So, and you know what? It worked, my plan, because she slept right through the night. And so did I. But another thing there at Omsey, which is kind of fun, is, they get, you see them at fairs and stuff, is they have those mirrors, right? What do you call it, concave and convex, and I can never remember which one's which. One makes you tall and thin, one makes you short and stout, right? And, it's always fun to laugh at each other when you see each other's reflections like that. But it kind of makes you wonder, well, what do I really look like? Because even with a normal mirror, does that actually really show the real you? Because it kind of does on the outside, right? But that's as kind of deep as it goes, isn't it? How do we really see the true image of ourselves? And if we don't like what we see, how do we change that? Because mirrors only show us so much, don't they? In James's day, there weren't mirrors like we have today. mirrors were polished metal, or you looked for your reflection in the water, and it wasn't that clear, I don't suppose. And again, mirrors today only reflect the outside, but James wants us to use a mirror that actually reflects what's inside our hearts. Let's read James chapter 1, verse 19 through 27. Know this, my beloved brothers. Let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. For the anger of man does not produce the righteousness that God requires. Therefore put away all filthiness and rampant wickedness, and receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. But be doers of the word and not hearers only, deceiving yourselves. For if anyone is a hearer of the word and not a doer, he is like a man who looks intently in his natural face in the mirror. For he looks at himself and goes away and at once forgets what he was like. But the one who looks into the perfect law, the law of liberty, and perseveres, being no hearer who forgets, but a doer who acts, he will be blessed in his doing. If anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, but deceives his heart, this person's religion is worthless. Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. As I said, we are in this series in James called Call to Action, and that's really the whole premise of James's letter. Not just to read his letter and go, oh, that's nice, and put it back on the shelf and move on to something else. It's kind of like making a film, right? You have a script, and the actors are there, the camera's there, the director's there, right? And they don't go, oh yeah, that's nice, and walk away, right? The deal with the actors is that they're supposed to put that script into action, right? You know, the chap with the board there, clap, act, whatever it is, scene one, take whatever. I don't know if they still do that or not, but they call action. And that's what James is calling us for. Action. To put into action the words that he has written. That's the whole point of what he is writing. And we might well say, well, why should I care what James says, right? When he calls us to take action. Well, we're not doing it on the basis of who James is, but James says we do it on the basis of who Jesus is. I wish there was a film we could see a recording of Jesus giving his Sermon on the Mount. Don't you wish that? Oh, that'd be fantastic, wouldn't it, right? Someone had a camera back then, and you could see that now, Jesus preaching on the Sermon on the Mount. And it's great to be able to read it, but to actually watch it, that would be really something. But you look it up on YouTube. But reading or watching Jesus give his Sermon on the Mount is not really the point, is it? That's not what Jesus said. Jesus spoke about all kinds of stuff to that crowd when he gave his sermon. And probably the crowd was held in rapt attention, and it all sounded so great, right? And Matthew says at the end that the crowd was absolutely gobsmacked. Well, he didn't quite say that, but he said that, Jesus was teaching as one who had authority and not as their scribes. And you can imagine someone coming home after hearing Jesus teach on the Sermon on the Mount, and, comes into the house and, oh, where have you been? Oh, I was coming home and I heard this rabbi giving this amazing sermon, and, oh, yeah? Well, what did they have to say? Well, he was talking about, who the blessed are, and kind of this reversal of fortune, and how to pray, and how not to be anxious, and all this other stuff too. Well, that sounds great. But we need some wood because I need to start dinner, and perhaps you could go out and get the wood, and all that just gets forgotten, and then life continues on unaffected again. In other words, you've heard the script, but there's no action that comes afterwards. there was another exhibit at OMSI, and it was there was a little man there, and you had to make this earthquake-proof shelter around this man, out of various blocks and things. And then there was like a bean bag that you dropped on top of it to see if it would stand. I don't know if bean bags fall down on top of you when there's earthquakes, but anyway. But when Jesus finished his Sermon on the Mount, he talked about building houses, didn't he? In fact, he used this illustration of building two houses. One was built by a wise house builder and the other by a foolish house builder. And one built his house on a foundation and the other didn't bother with a foundation. And at the end of their building, this massive storm came along and hit both houses, and the outcome was that the one on the foundation stood, but the one without a foundation was swept away. And Jesus says those who hear his words are like the wise builder who hears his words. And Jesus, of course, is the foundation. Who Jesus is, that he is the Son of God, that he came down to reveal God in the flesh. And what Jesus has done, that Jesus went to the cross and that he died for all the things that we have done against God. And when we place our faith in him, he is our foundation. We've talked about trials the last couple of Sundays, and of course the biggest trial that any of us are going to face is death itself. But Jesus, through his resurrection, has overcome even that trial. And so we build our houses on that foundation of faith in Christ. But a house without a foundation is not much good, but neither is a foundation without a house. You ever thought of that? A few years ago, went down to Mexico. We went down to Baja to do a mission trip, and as you drive down, I started noticing there were all these foundations sitting there. And then some foundations had a few blocks on them, and it's like, what is that? And what it is that in Mexico, it's not like here. You can't get a mortgage, and so you can borrow the money and build your house all at one go. Is that people build their foundation, and then as they have some money left over at the end of their paycheck, they buy a block here and there, and they, cement those blocks onto the foundation as they can. And the building of that house takes months, years even, before they can fully afford to build their house. And it kind of shows, right, that foundation is being used, even if it only has a block or two actually sitting on the foundation. And maybe that's a more realistic picture of how we are as we build our lives on Christ, We have this picture, we receive Christ and suddenly there's a big house, right, built there. But I don't know about you, maybe that's your case, but for me it's like, well, I build a block here and then I build another block here and another block here and gradually that house is built up on the foundation. But if we can't see any blocks at all placed on the foundation, it really kind of begs the question, are we actually using the foundation? Or is the foundation just going to waste? So our life group the other evening, we were talking about words that Christians use to distinguish themselves. Like, I don't know, a number of years ago it used to be, are you born again, right? And that was used to distinguish whether you're a real Christian or not. But then the emphasis is always on that one-time experience, right? And doesn't really take into consideration what comes after that. Until very recently, the term used was evangelical. Are you evangelical? But now that's kind of being dropped away because, it smacks of Christian nationalism and that kind of stuff. When we think of the term religious, we don't use that term very much either, because that comes with baggage too, doesn't it? That kind of smacks of legalism, maybe even hypocrisy, right? Oh, well, it's kind of a religion is something you do for an hour at a certain place, and then the rest of your life during the week you live completely differently. But that is the term that James uses. And it is the mirror that he wants us to look at. Are we practicing true religion? What are we building on the foundation? What do we see reflected back as we build on the foundation of Christ? Well, the first reflection James says that we should see is a reflection that considers. Let every person be quick to hear, and that is actually an imperative. In fact, in the Greek it says, you must know this. You must know this. It's not an option that you just kind of choose off the menu. You must know this. A few months ago, before Christmas, we did a couple of series and one was called Garden Design. And it was about our vision, and it was about our mission. And we had a couple of statements so that that's us, Garden Church, exists to know, enjoy, and express the love of Jesus. And then we, Garden Church, seek Jesus holistically. We love each other authentically. We serve humbly, and we send missionally. Those are foundational for us as Garden Church. And then we did a second series called Garden Care, and we talked about slurps. And some of you who weren't here are thinking, what is that? And no, it's not some sticky drink from 7-Eleven, but slurps stands for serving, listening, eating, resting, praying, and sharing. They're kind of 6 core things that we want to see happen in the church, in everything that we do at Garden Church. And when we think about the L1, listening, I don't know about you, but I think of that as something that's kind of more passive than active, right? When my dad was alive towards the last few years of his life, he would call me once a week, and he talked a lot, shall I say. And he was also deaf. So it wasn't really a conversation, it was kind of a monologue, and he would always kind of call me like during the day and when I was busy doing some other things. So I would prop up the phone, right, and have it on speaker, and he would talk away, and every now and again I would interject with, right, just to let him know that I was still there and be busy doing some other stuff, right, and yeah, maybe it wasn't the best thing, but there we are, and it was very, very passive on my part. But that's not really what hearing is it? Hearing is actually doing. Because none of us wants to be propped up, right, on the other end of a phone. And maybe we don't do that physically, but we do it mentally, don't we? We just prop the person up and we're going, but we're not really listening. We're not really understanding. Because it's a need that we all have. We all want to be heard. But in order to be heard, we really have to hear. And that is active. To understand the choice of words that are being used and what those words are conveying. Not all speech is verbal these days either, is it? In fact, a lot of speech is written. And it's written with caps even, right? That it shouts through whatever social media is being used. It strikes me, though, that we will not hear anyone properly until we have heard the Lord first. It's not till we hear the Lord. And we won't hear the Lord until we stop talking, that we are quick to listen. The foolish man didn't really hear that he needed a foundation. He just rushed off and started building his house. In Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, probably the most famous thing that he said is what we call the golden rule, isn't it? Do to others as you would have done unto yourself. And we love to hear that, don't we? Oh, that sounds so good. Do to others as you would have done to yourself. But I don't know about you, but I recognize the one snag to that saying is that you have to go first. Do to others as you would have done to yourself. It doesn't even say, right, oh, you wait until you see the others are going to do it back to you, right, that it's going to be reciprocal, because they might not ever do it back to you. But you have to go first. And that goes for hearing too. As much as we might want to go first and get what's ever on our chest off, right, we have to park our tongues. And we have to hear what somebody else has to say. And that means not only do we have to park our tongues, but sometimes we have to park our brains as well. Because they're off like thinking about what we're going to do next hour, next day, where we're going to go on holiday, what the weather's going to be like, all that kind of stuff, right? And I'm giving away what goes on in my mind here. So and we have to just hear. And that is active. That's not passive. And we have to stop thinking about how we're going to respond too. You know, we might get hung up on a certain word or sentence and think, oh, I got to answer that back. But no, keep hearing. Or we hear, or we think, you know, I can fix that for you. We hear a problem. I can fix that for you. I do that with my wife sometimes. And she's explaining something to me. And I was like, okay, I don't need to hear anymore. I can fix that. But she doesn't need me to fix it. She's more than capable of fixing it herself. She just wants me to hear what's on her heart. And if we are going to speak, then the words that we should speak are questions that clarify, that show that we really do understand what is being said to us, that we use to summarize back to the person what we have heard. And only then, when we've got it right and we truly have heard, do we have the right to speak then. Being quick to hear, slow to speak. But I don't think James means that we should never, ever use words, though. You know, there's that saying that's bandied around the place that goes like, preach the gospel and if necessary, use words. And it's always attributed to St. Francis of Assisi, who preached the gospel and if necessary, use words. But you know, if we are truly going to share the gospel of Jesus Christ, we do have to use words. Because just not using words is not enough, is it? We do have to use words. In fact, St. Francis, if you read the history of St. Francis, he never said that. And he certainly used words. In fact, apparently he was a pretty good preacher. There's a chap called Thomas of Salino who wrote his biography in 3 years after Francis died in 1220. And he writes that Francis sometimes preaching in up to 5 villages a day, often outdoors in the country. Francis often spoke from a bale of straw or a granary doorway. In town, he would climb on a box or up steps in a public building. He was preaching to any who gathered to hear the strange but fiery little preacher from Assisi. He was sometimes so animated and passionate in his delivery that his feet moved as if he were dancing. He certainly used words. But Thomas also recorded that St. Francis's instructions to his fellow monks. And this is what Francis told them, that the preacher must first draw from secret prayers what he will later pour out in holy sermons. He must first grow hot within before he speaks words that are in themselves cold. In other words, really what Francis is saying, that our words must have their source in the Lord. Our words must be built on the foundation of Jesus Christ. And we must hear him speak first before we get to speak, because we can't speak until we've heard Jesus speak. You know, even Jesus wanted to hear from people. Isn't that an amazing thing, really, when you think about it? He already knew, right? But he wanted to hear from people. The God of the universe, who created each and every single person, he still wants to hear from us today. I always love that story when Jesus is going to Jerusalem and he's going through Jericho, and there's the blind man, Bartimaeus, right? And he hears the crowd getting all excited. And who is this that's going past? And he's told that it's Jesus. And Bartimaeus starts shouting, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." And the people around about him, "Oh, shut up, Bartimaeus. Just shut up. He doesn't want to hear from you. He's not interested in some blind beggar like you, mate. Just go away." But Bartimaeus shouts even the louder, doesn't he? All the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And guess what? Jesus did hear his voice. Amongst all those other voices, he stops and he asks that Bartimaeus be brought over. And Bartimaeus leaps up, he leaves his clothing behind and goes to Jesus. And Jesus asked him this question: "What do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you?" And Bartimaeus asked that Jesus would restore his sight. See, Jesus hears. He doesn't just listen. He actively hears. And Jesus said to him, "Go your way, your faith has made you well." And then immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. So when we look in the mirror, do we see a reflection that considers, because we are quick to hear and slow to speak? Secondly, we need a reflection that curbs. Not only do we need to be quick to listen and slow to speak, but we need to be slow to anger. James says it's not that we shouldn't ever get angry. It's just that anger of man doesn't necessarily lead to the righteousness of God. Because sometimes we should get angry about stuff. A few weeks ago, I was walking down to church, and it's right beginning of spring, you know, and the cherry blossoms were out down at Waterfront Park, and it was a lovely spring morning, and just really enjoying that. And then I was walking past a bench, and there was a man slumped over on the bench, and in his hand he had the telltale square of silver foil. And it made me angry. Not angry at the man, but angry at the drugs, and that's allowed to continue on. And the contrast between what God had created in the cherries that were flourishing and blossoming, and this man's life that was crushed and broken through the sinfulness that we allow in this world. And as I look around Old Town and Portland, several things make me angry, in fact. But righteous anger can very easily slip into unrighteousness, can't it? A couple of Christmases ago, I was in London just before Christmas, and the whole Omicron thing was raging, right? And it wasn't actually a lockdown, but it was close. And I was coming back from somewhere, and I was on the tube, that's the underground, and I was standing on a platform. There wasn't many people around, and there was a woman standing just a little bit down from me, and you know, it's kind of down, it's warm down in the underground and cold outside, so she was taking off her jacket. And as she pulled the arm out of her jacket, her sleeve flipped out, right? And it just kind of brushed, really, this chap who happened to be walking past. And she apologized. And this man turned on her, and he said to her, "Why don't you take that stupid mask off, and then you'll be able to see what you are doing?" because it was, it was supposed to be wearing masks, right? And she was kind of stunned, obviously, and then he stomped off down the platform. And I was more stunned. And here's why I was stunned, because he didn't have a mask on. And although I didn't know him, I did recognize him, because I recognized him from a church I'd been at just a few days before. And what would she have thought? Obviously, she didn't know he was a Christian. But what would she have thought about Jesus if she had known that, right? She'd have probably thought worse than what I was thinking at that very moment, right? And unfortunately, we see it all the time, maybe not on tube platforms, but on other platforms, don't we? Where again, we know people who are Christians who are the angry ones, raging and shouting and screaming. And the problem is that the people that they rage and shout and scream at are the very same people we want to tell, well, Jesus loves you. And those things don't go together, not at all. And you say, well, it doesn't really reflect me. It's just a moment, right? It's the platform that induces that. But it does reflect. And it reflects really what's going on inside, doesn't it? Anger, it doesn't produce righteous words. It doesn't produce words that reflect well on Jesus. And what we see, it often depends on the kind of mirror that we use. When we use the world as our mirror, well, we look pretty good. I'm definitely styling it today, right? But it's a distortion, isn't it? Because we take a glance in the mirror and we think we look good, but that is not the mirror that we should be looking at. Because we're just trying to change the outside. And sometimes even when we look in the mirror of Jesus' words himself, if we don't really look at it closely, again, we can just think, oh, well, I can just change the outside. But if we just try and change the outside, that doesn't really change anything, because we have to change what's inside. And that's what James wants us to look into, this mirror of the perfect law that shows us what we really are. Not just glance at it and move on quickly, but to look in the perfect law of God and see who we really are. What do we see back in the reflection that it shows us? Well, the reflection it shows us is that we're really kind of broken and lost and struggling. It doesn't matter what platform we've tried to build our lives on. You go, oh, well, well, I look in the law and, it says, do not murder, right? And I haven't killed anybody. But of course, then Jesus, he redefined the law, didn't he? And he said, well, yeah, but if you've been angry with someone, angry enough to wish they weren't around anymore, then you've murdered them. And he went through and did the same thing for lust, and he did it for divorce and oaths and retaliation. And how about loving your neighbor and hating your enemies? And Jesus vastly deepened the law, didn't he? So that when we really look at the law, the perfect law of God, we look in that mirror and we go, uh-oh, I am in trouble. But one thing about mirrors, though, when we look in mirrors, they show us what's wrong, but they don't actually show us how to fix it, do they? They might show me, that my hair doesn't look so good, but it doesn't fix my hair for me. Not there's much left to fix anymore. But God's perfect law does do that, because Jesus said that he is the fulfillment of the law. That's what he said in his sermon. He is the perfect law of liberty. He is the one who sets us free. He is the implanted word, if you like. And that implanted word changes us not from the outside in, but from the inside out. It makes us more like Jesus. And when we receive the implanted word of Jesus, we start to reflect the values of God. It changes how we act. It changes what we say. You think of all that God has put up with since he created the world. Can you imagine that? I just can't really wrap my mind around that. You know, sometimes God obviously gets angry, and rightfully he gets angry. But what is God's nature? You know, Moses, he was a man who got angry. He suffered with angry outbursts all his life. In fact, in the end, it stopped him getting into the promised land. But he asked one time to see God's glory. And God's glory passed in front of him, and the Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. So when we look in the mirror, we need to see a reflection that curbs our anger. And lastly, we need to see a reflection that is compassionate. James says that religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit widows and orphans in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world. To let when we let our tongues run away with us uncontrolled, that is not keeping ourselves unstained and free from the world. That is not true religion. But nor is true religion being an inward faith with no outward expression. Bless you. Jesus told a story one time about when the Son of Man returns and sits on his glorious throne, and all humanity is brought before him. And he says, like a shepherd, they'll be divided into two groups, like sheep and goats. And on the one hand will be his sheep, and on the other hand will be the goats. And the right-hand group is welcomed into his glorious kingdom, and the left-hand group, well, is not. And what is the difference? And Jesus says, well, that when he was hungry and thirsty, those on his right hand fed him. And when he was naked, those on his right hand clothed him. And when he was a stranger, those on his right hand welcomed him in. And when he was sick, and when he was in prison, those on the right hand went and visited him. And they kind of scratch their heads and go, when did we see you like that? And he said to them, well, when you did it to the least of those, you did it to me. And conversely, the group on the left hadn't done any of those things. They had heard, but they had not done. Dallas Willard says in Renovation of the Heart that children of light are beyond the point where mere talks, no matter how sound it is, can make an impression. Demonstration is required. They must live what they talk, even in places where they cannot talk what they love. The children of light must be who and what they were called to be in Christ their head. The call of Christ today is to be his apprentices, alive in the power of God, learning to do all he said to do, leading others into apprenticeship to him and teaching them how to do everything he said. Doing comes from hearing. So that kind of begs the question, though, doesn't it, that if you are a doer, well, I must be in God's kingdom, right? You know, because there are a lot of people doing good things. I mean, we can look around like Portland, and there are people and agencies doing good, compassionate works in Portland, and that's a wonderful thing, you know. They've taken to heart some of Jesus's words. But is that the basis on which Jesus makes his division? Well, it's not, is it? Because if that was the basis on which Jesus made the decision, his division, there'll be no need for the crucifixion. There'll be no need for the cross and him suffering. We have to go back to that, to the mirror, right? The word. What does that reflect about what's going on in our hearts? Because even the best doer with the implanted word of God cannot do enough to earn their way into the kingdom of heaven. Doing must come from hearing and receiving the word. You know, at Garden Church here, we could look outside. I'm looking outside right now. And it's easy to get cynical. It's easy to get like hardened hearts, right? It's also easy to rush out and just start doing all kinds of stuff, right? And somewhere we have to fall in the middle. We need to be discerning about what compassion looks like. We want to be doers. We want to be compassionate, but we don't want to be enablers, though, either. We want to see things change. We've got some stuff coming up over the next few months. In fact, starting in just under, I should say, 2 weeks. There's the Starlight Parade, and we're going to be out there, and we're going to be out handing out some snacks and drinks and stuff for the Starlight Parade. We're going to have a barbecue the next day in Fields Park, and we have some barbecues lined up during the summer out there to demonstrate our compassion, because we want to meet people and we want to hear people and where people are in their lives and what they're doing in their lives and what's blessing them and what their struggles are. And later on in September, we're going to have this event called Impact Old Town right here, and we're going to be offering some various services, like bike repair, and I can't remember what else now, eye things. I think we're still kind of discussing exactly what services we're going to, but we want to be compassionate, right? We want to be doing compassion in Old Town. And yet we also know that the most compassionate thing we can offer anybody is the implanted word of Christ. Jesus went on a tour around different villages and towns, and he certainly met physical needs. Sometimes we have to meet physical needs before people are willing to have their spiritual needs met. But Jesus' compassion, when he saw the crowds, Matthew says that he had compassion for them because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. And then he said to his disciples, "The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." So when we look in the mirror, we must see compassion reflected back to us. What reflection do we see as we look in the mirror as a church, as individuals this morning? Are we hearers? And are we doers? And if we are hearers, what kind of hearers are we? Does our doing come from our hearing? And when we speak, what do we speak? What kind of words do we use? What platform are they built on? And do we reflect the compassion for the Lord, both physically